Hey, it's Michael Douglas. Welcome back to Dr. Pundit, where we talk about music, not medicine. And I want to talk about three important years in music history. And yes, you could make an argument for a lot of years that were important. And, as kind of this musical chronology part of my brain, I'm always thinking in terms of that every time I hear a certain artist or a certain song. And as the history of music continues to be written every day in this country, we tend to refer to these as eras or bedrock periods in music history defined by a beginning and an end within an artist's, say, a catalog or a musical movement or the development of a genre. Well, these 3 years in the 20th century, I think across the board are just really important for a lot of reasons. And so the criterion to include them in this episode is one of these are just pivotal years, period, from which you can glean a lot about the change in musical movements, the end of, say, an influential artist's career, the beginning of another one, or a lot of releases that are released that year that continue to show their influence, decades later. These are 3 years in and among themselves that are important in musical history. I hope that all makes sense. So let's get it all started. Okay, so it's hard to pinpoint the best year in music, or even the best 2 or 3 years. So there have been numerous times throughout music history when artists have been on a collective roll. There are certain years basically that seem to have fostered, I think, unparalleled creative freedom, which has allowed music to continue to evolve throughout decades in this country, going back to the early part of the 20th century. So let's just get it started. And 1969, I think, was a very pivotal year in this country with respect to music history. This year saw some phenomenal music releases, from the Beatles' swan song, Abbey Road, to The Who's Tommy. Rock had hit its stride as a genre in this country, and relatively quickly, because if you look at how different music sounded from, say, 1959 to 1969, it's easy to really think about that as a concept. Johnny Cash took us behind the scenes at the San Quentin prison in California for an unforgettable live album. And the Rolling Stones released Let It Bleed. The 60s, yes, were coming to an end, but they didn't go out with a whimper in this country. So this was a year, 1969, where it was the sheer number of very groundbreaking and influential releases that made this a very memorable year in music history. Honorable mentions would go to, say, Dusty Springfield, her Dusty in Memphis, and I would probably say Santana's Santana in 1969. So let's turn the clock forward 8 years to 1977, and my next entry into the top 3 years in music history is this year. From Fleetwood Mac's turmoil-drenched masterpiece Rumors to the early murmurs of punk and disco, this year saw a lot of landmark music emerge. And on a more somber note, this is also the year we lost Elvis Presley, who at the time was, it would be like saying Taylor Swift passed away today. I mean, that was only 20 years from his groundbreaking influence and debut that put rock into rock and roll. And I think you can credit Elvis Presley for that. It's quite interesting that, more than half a century later, yes, we still acknowledge his influence, but in the overall scheme of things, it's probably not the biggest influence. And I did another episode on Elvis Presley's death a few episodes ago. You may want to check that out, where I think I'd do a better job of explaining that perhaps. But I guess you could say in 1977, one of the forefathers of rock, Elvis Presley, passed away, but there were a lot of newer acts at the time that were ready to take up the mantle and go from there. A couple of honorable mentions here. Eric Clapton's Slow Hand was released this year, and the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, which set the stage and the bar for soundtracks and movies that featured hit music to follow after that. Finally, 1984. Some people say the 80s didn't begin until 1984, like culturally in the 1960s really didn't begin until 1964, Beatlemania, all of that. And what we think about when we think of the 1980s culturally, I guess that is a little bit true. Really began in earnest that year. From Michael Jackson's iconic Thriller, which was released at the tail end, December of 1982, he had more than a year to germinate the success of that album, which certainly bled over into 1984, to Madonna's hit follow-up to her self-titled debut, Like a Virgin. Pop music was rapidly changing on this front. Again, artists who had released rather successful albums in the early 1980s were just beginning to reach superstar status that year. Elsewhere, Band Aid recorded Do They Know It's Christmas for famine relief. This is the first time artists had come together on a large scale, providing the impetus to say, "We Are the World," which gathered in early 1985 after the 1984 Grammy telecast to basically do the same thing on these shores. Notable releases and honorable mentions go to two iconic album releases that year, Purple Rain from Prince and Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen. So there you have it, 1969, 1977, 1984. In my opinion, they were three generally pivotal years in music history. And I hope that you agree on some front and can kind of think about these years and, think about when you hear music from these years, how they influenced the next decade to 20 years in music history. That's all I aim to do on this channel. And if you like what you see here on the channel, please don't hesitate to like and subscribe. And as the late great Barry White always used to say, let the music play. And I'll see you on the next episode.